So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. My name is Daniela Schwarze, and I'm the director of the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund. It's a pleasure to have you here for our Transatlantic talk tonight with David Ignatius. David Ignatius is a writer for The Washington Post, a commentator, columnist on international affairs and other issues, and he's also a novelist. And I just learned that his latest novel, The Director, is going to come out in German, in the German translation later this year. So
thank you for that plug.
You will all know David Ignatius from his commentary. And I also want to highlight, of course, that he is a member of the Board of Trustees of the German Marshall Fund. David, it's a huge pleasure to have you here. And the title you chose, or we chose, I'm not quite sure who did, but the title of tonight's talk is U.S. Global Leadership, Future Priorities and Strategic Thinking. This in the midst of an electoral campaign which we observe with, I think, a high interest from Europe, not only from Germany, is a daring title. We are very keen to hear about the future priorities of the United States, whatever the result of the elections might be. And of course, where you see the strategic thinking on the other side of the Atlantic going, because we share so many common concerns and priorities in this world, which is becoming ever more complex and challenging. So we are very, very happy that you chose a topic of a global dimension, which is crucial for Europe. And I would also like to welcome Dr. Anne Sauerbrei, who is an editor with Der Tagesspiegel. You edit both an online part of the website of Tagesspiegel Causa, but also the related page in the newspaper. We know it well. Some of my colleagues have written on it. It's a pleasure to have you here as the moderator of today's session, and the floor is yours.
Well, David, there's so many explosive questions in foreign policy right now, but let's maybe start with the one question Germans are, in my experience, almost hysterical about: who's going to be the next president of the United States?
Well, I can't imagine why anybody would have any anxiety. Let me focus my comments first on Donald Trump and then on the political situation as a whole. I have been watching as my friends in Europe have seen that Trump has become a more and more serious and now dominant Republican candidate. At the Davos conference at the end of January, I was talking to a group of Europeans, and they said, Donald Trump isn't really as serious, is he? And I said, yeah, he could win the nomination. And there was a kind of audible gasp. And I think there's been a collective, as people have watched Trump, have heard him make statements that I frankly never imagined I would hear a prominent American politician make about banning people because of their religion from entering the United States, comments about Mexican immigrants that do have a racist tone, at least as they're heard by Hispanics. And just generally play to the fear and anxiety of voters in the U.S. I think the point that I would make to this audience, this actually shouldn't reassure anybody, is that the issue to really worry about isn't Trump. He's the same loudmouth that he's been for 20 years. He's America's most successful reality TV personality. There is something kind of weirdly, intoxicating about watching him. You never know what he's going to say or do. But he, to me, is the issue less than the people who vote for him. And that's what we need to pay attention to. The vote for him, the vote for Bernie Sanders, some of whose views on trade, I think, would really damage the United States over the long run. I mean, we're getting a clear message that there is a substantial part of America that is radically disaffected with the way the country is being governed, with its perception of the elites and the elites' policies, and I think, to quickly go to the sort of baseline issue, I think that the evidence of the last week in particular tells us that it's likely that Trump will get the nomination, but it's not likely that he'll win. As political analysts say, he has a high floor. There's surprising support for him, but he has a low ceiling, meaning that there are a lot of people in this latest set of exit polls who expressed sharp rejection of him on both the Republican and Democratic sides. So if I were to handicap this today, I would say that Hillary Clinton will win the Democratic nomination. That now seems almost certain, and that she probably will beat Trump. So in a sense, that relieves people who look at Trump's statements and worry about what that would mean for U.S. leadership. The underlying concern should still be there, that the people who have supported Trump, who are that angry, who feel that left out, the polarization and to some extent dysfunction of the United States, I see no sign that fever is going to break. That's a phrase President Obama likes to use. When is the fever going to break? When's the country going to come back to a center point? And it hasn't happened during his presidency. I don't think Hillary Clinton is a person who could break that fever either. Just to say one final thing. I wrote the other week about the theme of political decay in the United States. And I think that's what underlies this anger. People might not identify it that way, but we have a political system that hasn't been working adequately for really 15, 20 years. It just isn't solving problems. Immigration is an issue that's been bothering Americans now for really a couple of decades, but there's been no way to get to a solution. Francis Fukuyama, who many of you will remember because he wrote the famous essay, The End of History, wildly optimistic in 1989, has written a book about political decay, which I would recommend to anybody who wants to look at and think about these issues. And his basic point, as I summarized it, is one that Germans understand better than anyone. Good countries, countries with deep, rich traditions and cultures, can go bad. They can get in situations where people are looking for a way to channel their anger. They're looking for whom to blame, and Trump voters feel that good countries can go bad as much as people who are frightened of Trump. I mean, that's what the basic Trump voter says. Make America great again. My country is going bad. It's going in the wrong direction. Who should I blame for that? The problem with this way of thinking is that things that people do in their anger at political decay, reducing taxes, blaming the government, reducing government services, make the problem worse. Our government services simply, compared to European countries, we don't spend enough, we don't have competent bureaucracies in many cases, and that's just going to get worse. Then people get angrier because, in fact, the quality of government service will be worse. So, I'll end this by saying what America needs is a really great leader. We've been lucky in our history in periods of crisis. In the Civil War, out of nowhere, we got Abraham Lincoln, this extraordinary person, manipulative, brilliant, farsighted. In the Depression and World War II, Franklin Roosevelt was just an extraordinary leader. Churchill is the symbolic figure, but it was really Franklin Roosevelt who devised strategy. And so, we need a leader of that quality. Bill Clinton, I thought, was a great leader when he was president. He had personal liabilities, but he was a very good politician. So we need somebody of that quality. It'd be nice if Secretary Clinton could be that person. There's not a lot of evidence to support that now, but we'll see.
Do you see that person somewhere in the second or third ranks, somebody we maybe don't know yet in Europe, you'd like to pound out who could be that leader in the future?
I do meet a lot of smart young members of Congress. Tim Kaine, senator from Virginia, you probably haven't heard of, was talked about as a possible vice president for Secretary Clinton, is a remarkable politician. I mean, one of the most thoughtful people I know. He's one of President Obama's closest friends. Obama doesn't have a lot of pals, but Tim Kaine is one of them. There's some Republicans. The mayor of Los Angeles, of all people, is an extraordinarily smart, gifted young politician. They're, as Hispanics become more powerful and numerous in the U.S., there's a whole generation. We saw Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz on the right, but there are hundreds of politicians around the country who are coming up. So, I don't know if this is true in Germany. I would say the millennial generation, as we call it, people under 35, let's say. I just sense a greater engagement, more civic-minded, more passionate. I mean, I can see a generation of leadership that represents their values really turning around my country, but also I see the same, I sense the same in Europe.
I'm glad I asked because this sounded a little more hopeful than your first take on the question. Let's stick with Hillary Clinton. If she's the most probable outcome of this race, what will we have to expect from her foreign policy-wise?
Well, she's given us a good preview in her tenure as Secretary of State. She was a good Secretary of State. She was more a representational Secretary of State, carrying the message of America's presence around the world than she was a transactional Secretary of State. John Kerry came into the job and immediately began trying to negotiate deals in every direction. Kerry, I've never seen a diplomat who's as tireless as John Kerry. Secretary Clinton was different. She has good judgment about most policy issues. I've read her memoirs carefully, and it's striking that on some key issues, I'll give you a couple of examples, Egypt and how to manage the transition away from Mubarak. She wanted Mubarak out, but she cautioned the president, do this carefully. This could blow up. Do this carefully. She was right. The president decided, no, we have to do it yesterday. Out now. She was early to warn about Putin. Right before she left as Secretary of State, she sent Obama a personal letter that she quotes in her memoir, whose language is really haunting. I mean, it just gets Putin exactly right. I could cite other examples, but she's a person with good judgment. The one thing that should worry people is that Clinton has very high negatives. That she would come into office with the sort of Fox News machine going 24/7, and that makes it hard to govern. As President Obama has said, it's very difficult if people, have a deep, abiding animus toward a candidate. The president can change some of that. She might find a gear of leadership, a way to speak to the country. First woman president in our history. And, maybe there's a voice that speaks to the country and is transformative. So far, I haven't heard it from her, but that will be her challenge. That's the heart. She becomes president. That's the heart of her challenge. How to speak over the heads of this completely deadlocked, frozen political and communications establishment to the country, and in that connection, figure out again how to govern. And so that if she came and said, "I want the German Marshall Fund recommendation for how to," that's what we tell her.
But we would see continuity in the big lines we have seen with Obama, like being hesitant towards interventions,
She's more
priorities in
hawkish.
Asia?
I think she is more willing to use American force. She is more forward-leaning, certainly on Syria, where the president has been allergic to the use of military power in Syria. Secretary Clinton has repeatedly taken a more hawkish line. She has recommended safe zones, which the president worries would be the path to a much larger conflict. She will talk later about China and Asia, but she's been on the more hawkish side. She has very good relations with the military and the Pentagon. When she was a senator, she was on the Senate Armed Services Committee. She developed very close relationships with a lot of the senior officers, and she's kept those. So I think you should expect that she would be more willing. Any president who follows Obama is going to say, and probably is going to, in fact, be more willing to use American power. There is a perception that Obama's presidency was a period of some American weakness, or a perceived weakness. So I think the next president, whoever that person is, will try to address that. I hope not in ways that are crazy and dangerous, but I think that they're going to want to address that perception.
Mm. Let's maybe stay in the United States for just one more question. Obama's legacy. And we've probably all read the Obama Doctrine by Jeff Goldberg. I know you've read it. And in a tweet you said it's compelling, if not fully convincing. And I'd like to know which parts you find compelling and which parts not fully convincing.
Well, it's compelling to hear a president of Barack Obama's real brilliance lay out in such a personal way how he looks at foreign policy. That said, reading the piece is a reminder why people usually save comments that are this frank for their memoirs. I mean, he's still president for 9 months, and now that the Saudis know that he doesn't really like them, and that the Arab world knows that he thinks the Arabs are free riders. I went to a dinner party given by an ambassador last week, and there were a number of ambassadors, and he said, "Welcome to the club of free riders," which is one of the lines in this piece. Obama's anger at the free riders. His description of Massachusetts Avenue, where the Brookings Institution, the Carnegie Endowment, a bunch of other think tanks, not GMF, he referred to it as Arab-occupied territory. That's one that has. So, what is his legacy going to be? Something that I think Jeff Goldberg should have spent more time talking about, because it's central to his legacy and also how he made the decisions he did, is the Iran nuclear deal. From the day he took office and gave his inaugural address, he focused on it. His inaugural address stated clearly his intention to engage Iran and begin negotiations. He sent secret letters from the first weeks of his presidency. And he has been systematic in following through on that, both in secretly using force. Don't forget that the Stuxnet virus was significantly augmented. The pressure to take out Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon by going to cyber war was reinforced, significantly expanded under Obama. He got the regime of sanctions that I think was important in getting the Iranians to negotiate. But he was determined to get that deal, and in some discussions among foreign policy experts after the Goldberg piece came out, it's been made clear that one reason the president did not bomb Syria in August 2013 after they had used chemical weapons was because he had gotten indications from the Iranians that they would back out of the negotiations if he did so, that they could not remain in negotiations with the United States that was bombing their most important Arab ally. So, I mean, that's another example of how important this was to Obama. I think something that was left out that's really important is a mistake that Obama made that you couldn't help but be sympathetic with at the time. But it's clear now that it was a mistake, and it's important to understand the mistake. In 2011, Obama, well, really starting in 2009, but in 2011 with the Arab Spring, Obama saw the Muslim Brotherhood in the person of Mohammed Morsi in Egypt and President Erdogan, then Prime Minister Erdogan in Turkey, as the instruments of Islamist, democratic politics that were an alternative path for the Middle East. And my own judgment is that if he had continued with that, we would now see an alliance between Muslim Brotherhood states in Egypt and Turkey, which would be, it'd be a very different, I mean, as bad as the Middle East is, it would be even worse. So I think that was a mistake. The final issue, and this is really the heart of Jeff's piece, was President Obama right to think that America should step back from the Middle East after these very difficult and largely unsuccessful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? And as Jeff summarizes it, the president felt that we didn't need the Middle East anymore. America now is an energy superpower. We don't need to care about Saudi Arabia's oil flow. We can't really make much of a difference for the good we've discovered in our interventions in Iraq and elsewhere. And this process of trying to solve problems that we can't has led to a diminution of American power. That's the basic argument the president makes to Jeff and that the piece conveys. And he's saying history will judge that I was correct in this. Personally, as I look at this, I disagree on each point. I think the Middle East does matter to the United States. I think the United States can make a difference if we behave sensibly. And I think that if we don't, rather than helping, it ends up hurting the United States. And the way I ended my own commentary on this a couple days ago was, you know, the real lesson of the Obama presidency for me is, okay, let's take the president at his argument. You have to reckon with the following. As America stepped back in the Middle East, others stepped forward. Russia stepped forward. Iran stepped forward. The Islamic State and other jihadist groups stepped forward. Saudi Arabia stepped forward. Is the United States better off for that having happened? I don't think so. I find it very hard to make an argument that that's a better situation for us, for our allies, for Europe. So that's how I come out of it. But I think the great thing about, there's some problems from Jeff's piece, but the great thing about it is it allows the whole world to look at this and hear the president's authentic voice and then talk about it. I mean, we have a world in which people don't talk honestly enough about foreign policy choices. This will help.
Since we've sort of arrived in Syria now, let's maybe go from there for a supersonic walk around the world. You've already said, in your opinion, the Middle East still matters. And I guess the heart of the conflict is in Syria now. Do you have any hope for the Geneva peace talks that it will be a diplomatic solution?
I put that to one of the leaders of the Syrian opposition, who I talked with last Friday, who's an advisor to the person who's actually the head of the Syrian opposition, former Prime Minister Riyad Hijab. And he said that, in his judgment, this process is going to work. Not in the sense of recreating a unitary Syrian government quickly, but it will succeed in de-escalating the conflict. It will succeed in allowing a more disciplined assault on ISIS So he took a fairly favorable account. Certainly, Russia's decision to pull its troops back puts pressure on Bashar al-Assad to accept a political transition process that is like what's envisioned by Geneva. I mean, Geneva is a joint project of the U.S. and Russia. Russia's not going to stay around anymore and, prop up Bashar, so he has to make some hard decisions. There's an argument that this will push him even deeper into the corner with Iran. You could make an argument that this strengthens Turkey in a particularly dangerous way in the north. You can argue that this brings the latent battle between the U.S. and Turkey over the issue of supporting the Kurds in Syria much closer. But I think the reality is, as I talk to the combatants, Syria is a country I first visited in 1980 or 81. It's a country I really am fond of. When this war began, I got smugglers to take me into Syria so I could travel with the armed opposition. Went to an Aleppo that was even then being bombed to smithereens. It's just a terrible tragedy. I can't imagine that Obama really thinks that this outcome is the most preferable. But I think after this nightmare, there is exhaustion among the combatants. And I think what we're going to see is a de-escalation. I think people will basically hold the areas that they've got. I think I talked to the regime enough to be fairly confident the regime is prepared to allow people to hold in place. It knows there are places it can't govern, places it can't go. And so I think we'll have a sort of quilt with different patches for a few years and some sort of transition authority that will cope with that. I don't think I want to make predictions beyond that. Maybe I'll save if anybody wants to ask questions. The conduct of our special operations inside Syria is really stepping up. And if you think that ISIS is a threat that has to be dealt with aggressively, it's important that I think it is. So I think I don't want to send in an army, but I think a higher intensity of special operations activity is good, and they're doing it.
But who are you giving credit for that we are seeing these peace talks at all? You said it's fatigue, but sort of...
It's fatigue. I think Secretary Kerry has just refused to take no for an answer. I mean, everybody said, this is not going to work, you're naive, go down the list of the things people have said about Secretary Kerry, and he's just kept going. And one source of his belief that this would end up working was that he thought that the Russians were not stupid, that they had stepped into something they knew was very dangerous, and they would decide to step out. Basically, he was betting they wouldn't make the mistake that the United States made in Iraq. And guess what? They haven't. And so they're going to need this political process, I think, to work well enough that they're not humiliated and forced to go back in. I mean, if Bashar should, if Damascus, is shaking tomorrow, the pressure on Russia to go back in will be enormous.
President Putin has said that today, that they could be back in any second. What do you make of his strategy? What's his long-term strategy in the Middle East and in Syria?
It's often said that Putin is not a strategist but a tactician. He certainly surprises as a tactician both on the way in and on the way out. And we see with Putin's actions that surprise is a potent factor. When your moves are not anticipated, they have more impact. When I look at the fundamentals of Russia, I see a country in radical decline. population shrinking, one resource economy, and that resource isn't well managed, now selling for a fraction of what it used to sell for. Corruption so severe that it's basically eating the fabric of the. If you want to make an interesting comparison, think about the difference between China's leader Xi Jinping, who decided corruption in China is so dangerous to the future of the party's rule that I am going to take enormous risks in going after corrupt officials, including, most of the senior leaders of the Chinese military have now been replaced. Most of the layer of the Chinese intelligence service has been replaced. Party leaders around the country. Compare that with Putin. Putin just gets deeper into the mess of corruption. I think the fundamentals for Putin are so weak that I worry about a future Russia that begins to shake apart. But he plays this weak hand brilliantly. I used to think he was lucky. He was falling uphill. There is something of a political, very clever politician in his timing. He gets the Russian people. He gets that Russian yearning, and I think we Americans and Germans have to get it too. That Russian yearning to be taken seriously. I think your chancellor gets it better than we. I think it's a big mistake the United States has made. The Sochi Olympics was like a plea to the world: take us seriously, value our culture, look at our history. And I think for the most part, people just ignored it. And it's no accident in some ways that a few months later, here were Russian troops dressed in green entering Crimea.
We could probably talk about the enigma Putin for another couple of hours, but I'd like to move on, and before we open it up, say at least a little bit about Asia. And You've written your latest column on the conflict in the South China Sea, and you come to the conclusion that there might be a climax soon. What leads you to this conclusion?
So the last thing the world needs is another crisis. And I wrote this reluctantly, but I do think people need to see what's coming. The Chinese have asserted claims basically to all of the South China Sea. And for the last 3 years, they have been building these artificial islands on reefs to, establish those claims more strongly. In February, they began putting missiles on 2 of those islands, and they've put military radars on others that could support substantial military force. They did this despite the White House's belief that Xi, when he was in Washington in September for the summit meeting, effectively promised the president that he would not escalate this. And he said publicly in the Rose Garden that he would not militarize the conflict. Go back and find the quote. So we have one of those situations that's quite dangerous, where the White House thinks that a foreign leader lied to the president. That's not good. There's one other factor that I noted in the piece that I think people in Europe should think about, because I hope maybe they'd think it's in our interest to act with the United States. As we've watched China's growing power, the sensible response from foreign policy officials in the US and Europe has been, we want a rules-based order. Freedom of navigation, orderly ways of resolving disputes is the heart of how we want to see the world evolve and how we want to see China's power accommodated. So in 2013, the Philippines took a claim that China was unilaterally making excessive claims in their brief, took that to an arbitration panel in The Hague under the law of the Sea Treaty. They did what in a rules-based system you should do. That ruling is going to come out in April or May. And people who've talked to the arbitrators, I don't know why the arbitrators are talking to people, but they are, tell me that they're likely to uphold the argument of the Philippines that these moves are excessive. China has from the beginning rejected this process. So what's China going to do? I mean, it could be a month away. What's China going to do when an arbitration panel says their actions basically are illegal? Are they going to say, oh, okay, we're sorry? I don't think so. So one thing that we fear they may do is declare what's called an air defense identification zone, where basically you have to identify yourself and conform to their rules. Essentially, it's a way of asserting sovereignty over the airspace. And the Pentagon's already thinking about how important it will be to challenge that. You can't just let that in effect would be accepting their claims of sovereignty. In that challenge, the administration really would like to have allies that operate with us, fly planes with us, sail ships with us. Obvious allies would be in Asia, countries like Australia, Singapore, maybe if you get this. But Germany would be a country that you think of. The key parts of the trading system the trading system that depends on rules-based resolution of conflicts. So I just throw that out because, yes, it's coming at Washington, but I think it's also going to be an issue that Germany is going to have to think, what does it feel? Germany wants good relations with China, but Germany, I would think, would not want a unilateral assertion of maritime and air sovereignty in this space.
What would be a sensible reaction by the international community if that would happen?
I think initially simply challenging it. I mean, so when China similarly declared an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea in some areas that were disputed between China and Japan in 2013. It happened that the Pentagon had scheduled regular overflights of B-52s, great big bombers, through that space. It just happened like the day after the Chinese announcement. So they felt that they didn't have to go to the White House and ask permission because it was already scheduled. So they didn't ask permission. And there's a question, interesting question, if they had asked permission, would the White House said, no, that's too dangerous. So that's one reason this is, people are kind of wanting to make sure that there's a policy that's clearly framed in advance. So that's one thing you could do. If that didn't work, well, another thing you could do is actually help other countries that have claims to do what China's done. China wants to build artificial islands. Well, maybe Vietnam would like to do that. Maybe the Philippines would like to do that. The Philippines actually already has. I wrote about that in this column. They ran a ship aground, and they have been resupplying that ship. It's sort of an artificial island made out of metal. And guess what? Overhead, when they resupply it, are U.S. drones. That's interesting. So anyway, this is, as I say, I'm reluctant to tell you about another crisis, but this one is kind of coming at us.
So not a very hopeful perspective either. Let's open it up. And are there any questions?
I'd like to ask you, since we are in Asia
Right
now, I'd like to ask you about the pivot to Asia. That had Europe very worried, but then there was nothing to worry about because with the conflict in Ukraine, attention turned back to Europe, and then with the conflicts in the Middle East, Europe was the traditional partner in the Western alliance against ISIS. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about what to expect from a future president, if the pivot is happening now, or if there is a refocusing back on Europe, and what you make of the things that are going on with Europe, since we are apparently struggling quite a bit to find a common position on anything.
I think the pivot is real and will continue with the next president. Secretary Clinton was early when she, in her first year as Secretary of State, she went to Asia and made some of the preliminary contacts that became the pivot. The person she chose as her Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, Kurt Campbell, is the author of the pivot. So, she's very much identified with it, and I think you could be sure of continuity. Implicitly, in your question is asking, what about the transatlantic relationship? And I think that's really an interesting puzzle. As you say, the first order of business is for Europe to resolve its extremely difficult issues. I mean, what kind of Europe we're going to have in 2 or 3 years, we're not sure. My own sense is that the European project that we imagined 10 years ago probably has peaked. That's not to say that it'll fall sharply, but I think its maximum probably come down a little bit. I'd be surprised, assuming Britain stays in, the Brexit doesn't happen. I'd be surprised if other countries didn't ask for similar special concessions. I'm not sure that would be a bad thing. But that's going to be a weaker Europe than Germany and France had wanted. Is there some way for Germany and France to take a core part of Europe and make it stronger? Make it the kind of dynamic force that we don't know the answer to that. Part of it depends on whether Chancellor Merkel remains in office. Whether you all, this audience, would know far better than I. But so I think the first thing that has to happen is that those issues have to be resolved. What I really hope is that the United States, with its next administration, will be a faithful friend to countries that matter. I mean, one thing I've learned is that I spent a lot of time last year in Asia, going to Japan, going to Singapore, going to places that I hadn't, but with traditional friends and partners of the United States that come often to Europe, obviously, and keeping faith with our traditional partners. When they're in trouble, when they're having difficulty, standing with them, helping every way you can, doing a lot of things in secret to help them. I mean, that's what I want to see. Make sure the U.S. does. And a prominent German official said to me recently he couldn't remember a time when the U.S.-German relationship was as effective behind the scenes in dealing with problems as it is now. That's great. I mean, if people feel that. And so the basic answer would be, hope that continues.
We talked a bit about the Middle East. Could you please comment on the U.S.-Israeli relations? It's became more complicated under President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And what would be a prediction for President Clinton? Would relationships improve or not?
I think they will improve. She historically has had a close relationship with Israel, as did her husband. So I think she would make an effort to get the atmospherics, the tone right. That said, Secretary Clinton was in at the start of the secret opening to Iran that led to the nuclear agreement. She was the one who went to Oman to have conversations with the Omani leadership about creating a channel that would allow contacts with Iran. She sent her 2 top aides, Bill Burns and Jake Sullivan, on secret missions to Iran. So she, her fingerprints are all over this agreement. In terms of the, endlessly frustrating issue of the Palestinian problem, frankly, I'm not sure any American official at the top level has the stomach for going back at that right now. I mean, my own sense is that Israel probably is going to have to live with the reality that's emerged of a one-state solution. I mean, it's not a solution, but there is effectively one state. So how's that going to work? And Israel's going to have to look at that and think, is this really what we want? And then I'm just not sure. When I travel in the West Bank, I'm not sure there's land left for a Palestinian state. I mean, honestly, it's just like, I lived in a Palestinian village for a couple weeks way back in 1982. And, back then it used to be basically rocky hills and olive trees. And now that area is, from Jerusalem all the way to Hebron, is covered with settlements and outposts. There's just not much land left. So I think this is an issue on which I've gotten very pessimistic. I think the only way out is that Israelis will, if Israelis decide we don't want to live with the status quo, and then have them initiate it. America, you couldn't try harder than Secretary Kerry did, and he, got nowhere.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting remarks. I have so many questions, I don't know where to start with. I'm trying to reduce it to very few. I really still cannot quite imagine how a political transition in Syria could work. Transition to what? To where? Can you really imagine that the Assad regime would agree to be brought out of power by a democratic process, and that Iran and Russia would allow that? I mean, Russia bombed the civilians, in violation of the Geneva rules, whatever, just to let go what he was doing there. So I still cannot really grasp how this should work. The second is on Russia. Don't you think you underestimate the ambitions of Putin, of Putinism, his imperial ambitions, with all this nationalist energy he incited inside his country? When you say, well, he just wants to be recognized or be taken seriously or something, isn't that an underestimation? And on Trump, Donald Trump, I mean, the most, you spoke about his politics and interior politics, but in foreign politics, the most alarming thing is that he says, Putin is right. I want to be a leader like Putin, and I will go along with Putin. Do you think this is a real danger that would change the whole character of the American politics towards his allies and whatever you can think of? And Clinton, I agree with you that she would be more interventionist, more active, more aggressively. But is it still true after she has a party that has moved so much to the left, and a mood in the country that is quite isolationist? Is this still true that Clinton would be tougher on this than Obama under these new conditions?
Great questions, each of them. So just quick comments going down the list. The Syria outcome, I think will look, as I said, transitional, meaning the unitary state will not return for some time. Assad has argued that, okay, we'll have elections in 18 months, I'm going to run, I'm going to win, I'm going to continue to govern Syria. The opposition says that's unacceptable, and it's true. As long as he's president of Syria, you're going to have a continuing level of violence. The Russians, according to the Financial Times yesterday, tried in December to get Assad out and failed, in part because the Iranians don't want it. I guess the final way I'd answer this is, I first went to Lebanon in 1980. Lebanon had dissolved if anything, even more completely than Syria has today. Lebanon was divided into cantons. The city Beirut was shelled east to west almost every day. There were snipers along the Green Line if you tried to pass from east to west. It was gone. I mean, it was commonplace to say Lebanon was finished. Sykes-Picot is over, Lebanon is gone. Lebanon is still there. You know, Lebanese civil war lasted 15 years, but in the end, Lebanon didn't disappear as a country. And it may be that some process like that is going to happen with Syria, and it may take 15 years. You know, we may be very early in the cycle of Syrian decomposition. But the idea that, you know, it's so commonplace, it's like, you know, Sykes-Picot is over, you know, it's the end of all that. I'm not, you know, that may be, but the example Lebanon tells you it may not. And so, anyway, it'll be ragged, but I think it'll be less violence going forward. Lebanese Civil War had 2 years of intense violence, 70, 75, 76, and then lower levels. You talked about Putin's larger ambitions. I mean, yes, but the interesting thing is that, as gamblers say, Putin knows when to fold his hand. You know, he knows when to hold him, when to fold him, if you know that country music song. He's pretty good at it. And, you know, he is a man of hybrid warfare. You know, he sends the troops in green uniforms. It's always deniable, at least in Ukraine. Trump does have a disturbing affinity for Putin. I mean, people say, well, what would Donald Trump do as president? What kind of foreign policy leadership? And, you know, all I can think of is that he thinks he's one of the big guys, you know, and he'd get the other big guys like Putin and Xi and, you know, Angela Merkel's a big guy. And they'd all sit around, like big guys, and they'd make a deal, you know, and he'd make some outrageous demand, and everybody would walk out, and then they'd, you know, sit down again, and then they'd figure it out. I think it's wildly naive. I mean, just illustrates, really, it's amazing how much he doesn't know about foreign policy, even about business. I was just looking at some of his statements about business. But, you know, Putin at least had the experience of being a KGB officer to kind of train him in the wiles of statecraft. You know, if we could get Trump to spy school, that might help. Is there an isolationist mood in the U.S.? Yes, but it's not isolationist. But it's, you know, we're wounded. We've had 15 years of wars that went badly. Country feels we've been spending money and blood for nothing, and that's deep. But that said, one real complaint about President Obama is that he isn't tough enough, and that the country feels unsafe about terrorism. And that, you know, so I think a firmer line, so long as it doesn't lead to a new American ground war in the Middle East, a firmer line probably will have public support. I'd be surprised if it didn't.
So since we're already sort of on the topic of the potential next U.S. political leader, as scary as that sounds, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned about sort of the degree to which the United States really needs a strong transformational leader right now, which on the one hand, I certainly concur and wish we had one of those in the race, particularly on the Republican side right now, so that we were not talking about Trump ad nauseum. But I think the question I have also is, in hoping for a strong leader to sort of pull us out of the moment we're in, does that also, to a certain degree, neglect some of the underlying structural issues that actually are going on in the U.S. that are sort of the sources of the anger that you mentioned? When thinking about Trump, the real problem is, of course, the issues that are inflaming sort of anger in the population. And so, especially in thinking about the connection between domestic policy and foreign policy, how do you think about U.S. leadership in a world where we're relying on the next leader rather than making changes to our institutions? That
question isn't just right. I wrote about trade tomorrow, and I do think that of all the dangerous ideas that this campaign has set loose, the idea of dismantling free trade agreements is the worst for two reasons. I think it will really hurt the U.S. economy, and I think it will vitiate U.S. global leadership. China's dying to start its own trade network as an alternative. That said, it's undeniable that there are American workers that have been hurt by globalization and that U.S. manufacturing did suffer some losses. The answer isn't, I mean, TPP actually is that rare trade agreement that probably benefits the U.S. I mean, somebody just estimated the benefits are 18 times the costs. But there are costs, and so the answer is figure out better ways to help the people who are hurt. I mean, that's what the debate should be. How do we help people make that transition? How do we help the guy who, I mean, white men are really feeling embattled for all sorts of reasons, but one is that they feel their jobs are vulnerable and taken by globalization. And that's not a trivial, I mean, they express it in support for Trump and other ways that are disturbing, but there's a real issue there, which is people have been hurt by this process of transition, and you need to be attentive. It's true with Europe. How does Europe live in a more globalized economy where traditional labor protections in France and Germany are reduced? Some of the apparatus of the welfare state is. How do you take care of people in that world? The more I look at the U.S. economy, the big problem is that as the distribution of income has become more skewed, so that rich people get a larger and larger share, rich people don't spend as much. I mean, their propensity to save is much higher because they have so much money. So that kind of engine of spending and that goes through the economy, and I think that's one of the reasons that the growth has been so sluggish is increasing inequality. So that's something that I really hope that Clinton as president would address. But the person I think is wisest about this, he doesn't get much credit for it, is Larry Summers. I think Larry Summers has thought very deeply about inequality and how inequality is really at the heart of the problem that he calls secular stagnation. But I think there are a lot of good ideas out there about how you change some of the things that are making people angry that end up getting expressed in this campaign by both Sanders and Trump supporters. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I guess we'll have the opportunity to maybe ask some more while we have food. And thank you very much for coming, all of you, particularly you, David, for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.